Shadows in the snow. The snowstorm arrived like a predator, silent at first, then roaring and relentless. The Wilsons, Ryan, a single father, and his daughter Maddie were among the dozen or so guests at Whispering Pines Lodge, a remote retreat tucked high in the Adirondack Mountains. Ryan had booked the trip as a way to reconnect with Maddie, who had been distant since her mother's death 2 years earlier. By the time the storm hit, the lodge was completely cut off. No cell service, no landlines, no way down the treacherous mountain roads. Just the wind howling outside and the snow piling higher by the hour. "It's kind of like a snow day on steroids," Maddie said, trying to sound cheerful as they sat near the massive stone fireplace in the lounge. But her eyes betrayed her unease. The storm was no friendly flurry. It was something mean, something hungry. The other guests seemed to feel it too. There was a tense undercurrent among them. A businessman glued to his laptop as if sheer willpower could summon Wi-Fi. A honeymooning couple arguing in hushed tones, an elderly woman knitting so tightly her fingers trembled. Then there was the lodge itself, old, creaky, and steeped in shadow. The kind of place where you half expected to see a face staring back at you in the window. Even if you were on the 3rd floor, the first person disappeared on the 2nd night. "Where's Gary?" someone asked at breakfast. Gary was the businessman with the laptop. His absence felt like a hiccup in the rhythm of the lodge. A quick search turned up nothing. His room was empty, his coat still hanging by the door. Outside, the snowdrifts were smooth and untouched, save for a single deep shadow that stretched unnaturally long in the early morning light. By noon, another guest was gone. The elderly woman with the knitting needles. Her chair by the fire sat empty, her unfinished scarf draped across the armrest. Again, there were no footprints in the snow, no sign of struggle, just another shadow in the drifts, dark and strangely fluid, as though the snow itself had been stained. Ryan felt his chest tighten. "Maddie, stay close to me," he said. The shadows didn't move, not exactly, but if you looked at them too long, they seemed to deepen, to ripple, like something was shifting just beneath the surface. By the 3rd night, the lodge's guests were down to half their original number. Panic had taken root. The honeymooning wife screamed at the lodge's manager, demanding answers. The manager, a wiry man with hollow eyes, could only stammer about the storm and the mountains. "This place has stories," he admitted finally. "Old ones. The locals talk about shadows that come down from the peaks when the snow falls heavy. They say the shadows take those who deserve it." "Deserve it?" Maddie asked, her voice sharp with fear. "Sins," the manager said. "Guilt. The shadows. They know." Ryan's stomach churned. He had his own guilt, a secret he'd buried deep. His wife's death hadn't been an accident. Not entirely. He'd been drunk that night, distracted, as he argued with her on the icy road. He'd survived. She hadn't. Maddie didn't know the truth, and he'd worked hard to keep it that way. But what if the shadows knew? That night, Maddie woke Ryan with a terrified whisper. "Dad, look." He followed her gaze to the frost-covered window. Outside, the shadows in the snow were gathering, pooling together like ink spilling across paper. They weren't just shapes anymore. They had weight, dimension, and they were moving slowly, deliberately toward the lodge. Ryan grabbed Maddie's hand. "We're leaving." "Into the storm?" she asked, her voice shaking. "We'll follow the road. Stay ahead of them." They dressed quickly, layering against the bitter cold, and slipped out the back door. The wind was a living thing, screaming in their ears and tearing at their clothes. The snow was blinding, but Ryan held tight to Maddie's hand, pulling her along the barely visible road. Behind them, the shadows followed. They moved faster now, gliding over the snow like hunters that had caught a scent. Ryan's legs burned. His lungs felt like they were filled with ice. Maddie stumbled, and he pulled her back up, ignoring her sobs. He couldn't let the shadows take her, not her. But the shadows weren't after Maddie. They stopped suddenly, pooling together in the snow ahead. Ryan froze, Maddie clutching his arm. The shadows twisted, rose, and took shape. They formed a figure, vague, shifting, but unmistakably human. "A woman." "Mom?" Maddie whispered. It wasn't her mother, not really. But the resemblance was cruelly close. The shadow woman raised an arm pointing directly at Ryan. "No," he whispered, "no, please." The shadow woman's voice was like the wind, cold and cutting. "She knows?" "Knows what?" Maddie asked, looking between her father and the shadow. Ryan couldn't speak. Tears froze on his cheeks as the shadows surged forward. They didn't touch Maddie. They surrounded him instead, pulling him down into the snow, into the dark. By morning, the storm had passed. Rescue crews found Maddie wandering the road, frostbitten but alive. Of the lodge, there was no sign, just a smooth expanse of snow and a single shadow lingering where the front door had been. Maddie never spoke of what happened on the mountain. But sometimes, on cold winter nights, she dreamed of shadows and of her father's voice calling to her from somewhere far below the snow. The collector Raymond Hart was a man of quiet routines. His shop, tucked away on a cobblestone street in the coastal town of Havenport, was as much a part of him as the crooked smile that appeared when he ran a hand through his thinning gray hair. The sign outside read Hart's Antiques in faded letters. But to anyone who really knew him, it was just Raymond's place. A forgotten little shop where things went to die. Raymond liked it that way. He liked the stillness of the ocean breeze that seeped through the cracks in the window shutters. He liked the dust motes that danced lazily in the low light. And most of all, he liked the antiques. They told stories. They had histories. But it wasn't long before the antiques started telling stories he wasn't ready to hear. It began with a tarnished silver mirror. A local fisherman dropped it off one morning. A haggard man who wouldn't meet Ramon's eyes. He said it had been his grandmother's, but Raymond could tell there was something wrong with it. The mirror was too old, too unnaturally polished. "I'm getting out of here," the fisherman mumbled, hurriedly leaving as though he'd just narrowly escaped something. That evening, Raymond wiped the dust from the mirror and set it in the back corner of his shop. That night, he couldn't sleep. The mirror haunted his dreams, calling, pulling him in. When he finally couldn't take it anymore, he went back to check it. But when he peered into the glass, there was someone there with him. The reflection wasn't his. It was a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes that stared back at him. He nearly dropped the mirror, but something compelled him to keep it. It was almost as though the thing knew something about him. The next morning, Raymond received a box, unmarked, with no return address. Inside was a small carved wooden box. It had intricate designs, symbols Raymond recognized from old family heirlooms, but he couldn't remember where from. When he opened it, a foul stench poured out, and inside there was an old ring coated in dirt and grime. Before he could decide what to do with it, a woman appeared in the doorway. She was tall, with raven black hair that hung like a curtain over her face, and her hands were twisted in a claw-like grip, almost as if she had been holding something too tightly for too long. She didn't speak, only pointed to the ring with an unsettling intensity. Then, without another word, she vanished, leaving only the lingering smell of decay. From that day on, Raymond couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone anymore. He felt eyes on him when no one was around, heard soft footsteps following him in the dead of night, and sometimes, just sometimes, he could swear the items in his shop were moving, whispering, as if they were alive. Days passed, and the items kept arriving. A cracked porcelain doll with a missing eye, a rusted sword with carvings of ancient faces, a weathered journal with pages that seemed to turn themselves. Each item came with a strange weight, a heaviness, as though the past was pressing down on him with more force than he could bear. It was when he found the old photograph that things took a darker turn. Tucked inside the journal, a photograph of his grandparents, standing in front of a house he had never seen before. The house in the picture looked abandoned, overgrown with ivy. The people in the photo had cold eyes, eyes that looked too familiar. And there, in the background, was something else. A figure, shrouded in shadow, barely visible, but unmistakably there. That night the woman returned. Her voice was a whisper in the back of his mind, soft but insistent. "They've come for you, Raymond. They always do." The items, every cursed, twisted thing that had arrived in his shop, had come for him. They were part of a collection of objects that were tied to his own family's dark past. Greed had driven them. Greed had cursed them. And now, that same curse was slowly closing in on him. With each passing day, Raymond became more certain that his family had made some kind of deal. Something terrible. Something that involved the collection of cursed objects, passed down through the generations. The mirror, the ring, the doll, it was all part of the same thing. Each item was a piece of the puzzle, each one representing a different part of the curse. And now, the final piece was ready to be added. One night, after hours of searching through old family records and journals, Raymond came to a horrifying realization. The last item in the collection had always been intended to be him. He wasn't the dealer. He was the final piece, the last object to be claimed. His bloodline had been condemned long ago, and now it was his turn to be trapped in the collection forever. As he stood in the center of his shop, surrounded by the cursed items, he felt the weight of his family's sins pressing down on him, crushing him. The door slammed shut and the air turned ice cold. He could hear the soft rustling of things moving around him, closer and closer. Raymond turned to the mirror, his own reflection now distorted, fading into something else entirely. He could see the faces of his ancestors in the glass, their hollow eyes watching him with cold satisfaction. The woman, the one who had come to him time and time again, stepped from the shadows, her face now visible in the mirror. Her lips curled into a smile, and as she whispered, "Welcome home," the mirror cracked and the shop went dark. Raymond Hart was no longer the antiques dealer of Havenport. He had become just another cursed item, added to the collection. The devil wears my dad's face. When I was 8 years old, I learned how to read the air in a room. Some kids memorized multiplication tables or played make-believe. I learned to gauge the weight of silence, to recognize the sharpness of footsteps on the floor, to interpret the tone of a sigh. It became second nature, a skill I didn't even know I had until much later. Survival has a way of teaching you things without asking if you're ready to learn. My father wasn't always angry. At least I don't think he was. I have vague memories of him sitting in his recliner, a cigarette balanced between his fingers, laughing at something on the television. Those moments were rare though, and as I grew older, they felt more like pieces of someone else's life that I had accidentally wandered into. The man I remember most clearly was the one who filled every corner of our house with his rage. It wasn't the kind of anger that exploded all at once. No, it was slower than that. It simmered, building under the surface until the smallest spark set it off. A glass left on the table. A shoe not placed neatly by the door. A toy left in the wrong room. Those were the kinds of things that turned his voice into a weapon, his hands into something I flinched away from. My mother never got in the way. She had learned her lessons long before I was old enough to notice. She kept her head down, her voice quiet, her movements careful. I used to wonder why she didn't leave, why she stayed and let him do what he did. But as I grew older, I began to understand. Fear is a powerful thing. It roots you in place, wraps itself around you until escape feels impossible. I was 10. The first time I tried to run away. I had packed a bag with some clothes, a book, and the little bit of cash I had saved from doing odd jobs for the neighbors. I waited until the house was dark and silent, my father's snores rumbling through the walls, before I slipped out the back door. The night air was cold, but it felt good on my skin, like freedom. I made it 3 blocks before I stopped, sitting on the curb and staring at the empty street ahead of me. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know who to call. I sat there until the sun started to rise. Then I walked back home. He never found out about that night. If he had, I don't know what he would have done. The thought of it kept me from trying again. By the time I was 14, I had learned how to stay out of his way. I spent most of my time in my room, the door closed and locked whenever I could get away with it. I kept my music low and my movements quiet. When he was home, I tried to become invisible. Sometimes it worked. Other times it didn't matter what I did. He would find me anyway, his voice sharp and cutting, his hands heavy and unrelenting. One night, he came home drunk. That wasn't unusual, but something about the way he moved that night scared me more than usual. He stumbled through the house, slamming doors and muttering under his breath. I stayed in my room, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for the inevitable. When he finally reached my door, I could hear the anger in his voice before he even spoke. "Open the door," he growled. I didn't move. I thought maybe if I stayed quiet, he would leave. I said, "Open the door." The doorknob rattled, then shook harder as he tried to force it open. I pressed myself against the far wall, my hands trembling. "I know you're in there," he shouted. "Open this door right now, or I swear." The sound of wood splintering filled the room as he kicked the door open. I froze, unable to move as he stepped inside, his face twisted in fury. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he demanded, his words slurred. "You think you can lock me out of my own house?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My throat felt like it was closing, my chest tightening as panic took over. He stepped closer, his hand raised. I flinched, bracing for the impact, but it never came. Instead, he grabbed the lamp on my bedside table and hurled it against the wall. The sound of shattering glass made me jump, tears streaming down my face as I curled into myself. "Clean it up," he said, his voice cold. Then he turned and walked out, leaving the door hanging off its hinges. I didn't move for a long time. When I finally did, my hands shook so badly I could barely hold the broom. I swept up the broken glass and threw it away, then sat on my bed and stared at the floor until the sun came up. That night was a turning point for me. I realized then that I couldn't keep living like this. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I had to find a way out. I started saving money, taking on any job I could find. I spent hours at the library, researching ways to get emancipated, and looking up shelters and resources for kids like me. It wasn't easy. It took years of planning and waiting, of pretending everything was fine while I worked toward my escape. But eventually, I did it. I packed a bag and left, this time for good. I found a shelter that helped me get back on my feet, helped me start a new life. I wish I could say I left it all behind, but the truth is, the scars my father left, both the ones you can see and the ones you can't, will always be with me. I still flinch at loud noises. I still have nightmares. But I'm free now, and that's something he can never take from me. The Forgotten Ward. The rain fell in sheets as Emily Carson approached Blackwater Psychiatric Hospital. The building loomed against the night sky, its crumbling facade illuminated by flickering security lights. She clutched her bag tighter, second-guessing her decision to accept the job. But after months of searching, this position had been her only offer. "You'll get used to it," The head nurse, Linda Graves, had said during her interview, "It's not as bad as it looks." It was worse. The inside of the hospital smelled like bleach and damp stone. The corridors were narrow and lined with peeling green paint. Patients shuffled past in slippers, their eyes hollow, their voices muttering incomprehensibly. Emily's first few days were uneventful, if unsettling. She worked the night shift, monitoring patients and administering medication. But the job had an unspoken rule: never stray too far from the active wings of the hospital. On her fifth night, Emily's curiosity got the better of her. She'd heard rumors from other staff about a part of the hospital that had been sealed off decades ago. Some said it was due to budget cuts. Others whispered about unexplained deaths. "It's just old stories," Linda had said when Emily asked. But her tone carried a note of warning. That night, with the hospital quiet and her rounds finished, Emily decided to explore. Armed with a flashlight, she ventured into the eastern wing, where the corridors were darker, colder. The air felt different here, heavier. At the end of the hallway, she found a door marked Ward C. Rusted chains and a heavy padlock secured it. Emily's heart raced as she examined the lock. It had been cut recently. Someone had been here. She pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. Beyond it was a stairwell that descended into darkness. The air was colder still, carrying a faint metallic smell that made her stomach churn. She almost turned back, but something urged her forward. The stairs led to another set of hallways, untouched by time. The walls were lined with steel doors, each with a small barred window. Through the windows, Emily saw rooms frozen in the 1950s. Rusted bed frames, crumbling mattresses, restraints dangling like forgotten memories. Her flashlight beam caught something on the wall. Words scratched deep into the plaster. "Fear lives here." A sound broke the silence, a faint, wet whisper. Emily spun around, the flashlight shaking in her hands. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The whisper came again, closer this time. She followed it, her footsteps echoing unnaturally. At the end of the hallway was a larger room. Inside, she found a desk covered in old medical files. Most were illegible, but one name stood out: Margaret Carson. Her mother's name. Emily's blood ran cold. Her mother had worked at Blackwater decades ago, but she'd never mentioned Ward C. The file described a patient, Margaret Carson, admitted in 1954 for delusions and paranoid behavior. But it wasn't her mother. It couldn't be. The dates didn't match. Still, the resemblance was uncanny. The photo paper was brittle, but the woman's face stared back at Emily with wide, terrified eyes. Behind her, the whispering grew louder, overlapping voices now. She turned, and her flashlight flickered, then died. The room plunged into darkness. Emily's breaths came shallow and fast. The whispers coalesced into words. "You shouldn't be here." A figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, its form shifting and amorphous, like smoke trapped in human skin. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its voice slithered through Emily's mind. "They brought me here," it said. "Fed me their fears. their guilt. And now, you. Emily stumbled back, her hand brushing against the desk. She felt something cold and heavy. A scalpel left behind. The figure moved closer, and she swung blindly. The blade passed through it, hitting nothing but air. The voices grew deafening. Faces appeared in the walls, mouths open in silent screams. The floor beneath her seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat. "Why me?" she cried, tears streaming down her face. The creature paused. "You know why. It's in your blood." Memories surfaced, unbidden. Her mother's late-night ramblings about a darkness she'd escaped. Her refusal to talk about her years at Blackwater. The way she'd warned Emily, again and again, never to dwell on the past. Emily's legs gave out, and she sank to the floor. The creature loomed over her, its form shifting into something familiar. Her mother's face, but twisted, wrong. "You left us here," it said in a voice that wasn't her mother's, but close enough to shatter Emily's heart. "Now you'll stay." When Emily was found days later, she was catatonic, her hair streaked with grey. Ward C was sealed off again, its horrors buried beneath layers of concrete. The hospital quietly closed within a year, the rumors of hauntings too persistent to ignore. Emily never spoke of what she saw, but in the quiet of her room at the psychiatric facility where she now lived, she scratched words into the walls over and over. "Fear lives here." The sleepless town. The town of Middleton was quiet, nestled deep in the heart of New England, where nothing ever really happened. But one Sunday morning in late October, things changed. People came out of their homes bleary-eyed, yawning, rubbing at faces lined with exhaustion. The sheriff, Dean Calder, didn't think much of it at first. He chalked it up to the weather. It had been one of those heavy, brooding nights where the fog clung to the streets like cobwebs. But by Tuesday, things got worse. No one in Middleton could sleep, not a wink. At first, they tried the usual remedies: warm milk, lavender, over-the-counter pills. Nothing worked. It was like some invisible force had crawled into their minds and flipped a switch. By the end of the first week, the town looked like a ghost of itself. People shuffled through the streets like zombies, their faces pale, their eyes sunken and bloodshot. And then the hallucinations began. It started small, shadows moving where they shouldn't, whispers that had no source. But soon, people were seeing things that weren't there at all. Mrs. Beasley, the town librarian, swore her dead husband was sitting in his favorite chair in their living room. Old Man Hawkins claimed the trees behind his house had started talking to him, their branches stretching toward his windows like claws. Sheriff Calder didn't know what to make of it. He wasn't sleeping either, but he was used to running on fumes. Caffeine and adrenaline had kept him going through worse than this. But when he started seeing things, he knew it wasn't just some kind of shared hysteria. It was real. The first real clue came from one of the town's kids, a teenager named Jake Wilkins. Jake came into the station one night, shaking like a leaf, clutching a notebook to his chest. "Sheriff," he said, "I think it's the church." Dean leaned back in his chair, exhaustion weighing him down like a wet blanket. What church? The old one, out on the edge of town. St. Matthias. I went out there with some friends last night. Just messing around, you know? But there's something wrong with that place. Dean frowned. St. Matthias had been abandoned for decades, ever since Reverend Thomas Blackwell disappeared back in the 70s. There were rumors, of course. There always were in small towns, but Dean had never put much stock in them. Still, something about the look in Jake's eyes made his skin crawl. "What did you see?" Dean asked. Jake hesitated, his fingers tightening on the notebook. "I heard chanting, and there were candles like someone had been there recently. But that's not the worst part." He opened the notebook and shoved it across the desk. This was carved into one of the pews. Dean stared at the sketch. It was a symbol, circular, with jagged lines radiating outward like a sun, but distorted, wrong. It made his stomach churn just looking at it. "I think it's some kind of ritual thing," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Blackwell was into that kind of stuff, wasn't he?" Dean didn't answer. He didn't have to. Everyone in Middleton knew the stories about Reverend Blackwell. The way he'd become obsessed with ancient texts, the strange sermons he'd started giving in the months before he disappeared. And then there was the night the congregation found the church empty, the altar stained with something dark and sticky, the air thick with the smell of burning wax. The sheriff decided to visit the church himself. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He just grabbed his flashlight and his revolver and headed out. The road to St. Matthias was overgrown, the trees leaning in like they wanted to keep him out. By the time he reached the clearing, the moon was high, casting long skeletal shadows across the crumbling stone facade. Inside, the air was thick and damp, heavy with the smell of mildew and something sweeter, almost metallic. The pews were broken, scattered like bones, and the altar was covered in waxy black drippings. But it was the back wall that caught Dean's attention. Carved into the stone, stretching from floor to ceiling, was the same symbol Jake had drawn. It seemed to pulse in the moonlight, the lines shifting, writhing like something alive. And then he heard it, chanting, low and guttural, rising and falling in waves that made his teeth ache. It wasn't coming from any one place. It was everywhere, surrounding him, pressing in on him like a vice. Dean turned, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, and saw them. They weren't people, not anymore. The faces were wrong, stretched too thin, their eyes black pits that reflected nothing. They stood in a circle around the altar, their hands clasped, their mouths moving in perfect unison. Dean's heart thundered in his chest as he raised his gun. But before he could pull the trigger, the chanting stopped. The figures turned to him, their heads tilting in eerie synchronization. One of them stepped forward, a tall skeletal man in tattered robes. His face was twisted into something that might have been a smile, and his voice, when he spoke, was like nails scraping against glass. "You've stayed awake long enough, Sheriff," he said. "It's time to dream." The last thing Dean saw before the darkness took him was the symbol on the wall, glowing brighter and brighter, until it swallowed everything. When he woke up, he was back in his office, the morning sun streaming through the blinds. The town was quiet again, the streets empty. But Dean knew the truth. Middleton wasn't free of the curse. It had just gone back to sleep,